Everyone. Oh, there it is. I like that. Exactly. Nice and loud. Nice and loud. We do. They're outside. Yes. I sent it to your phone. Yeah. So, how are you guys doing? What you guys talk about last week, by the way? Do you remember? Time. Good. Good. What about time? Yes. What else? The God is. What's that E word? Eternal. Yeah, God is eternal. So today we're going to talk about immutability. Immutability. So month of July, Melissa and I are going to have our 22nd anniversary. Yes, yes. Gift are accepted. Uh, Gift cards, absolutely. Melissa's saying yes, right? Uh, so when I had proposed to Melissa, I I was a young man just out of college, and I had this job, and my boss said, "Hey, I want to give you a book now that you're going to get married." So I'm thinking, "Oh, great! Like he's an unbeliever. What book is he going to give me?" And he give me this book that is called letter A in your introduction. Who moved my cheese? Who have you ever heard of that book? Anyone here? Oh wow! I'm like really surprised. So you know that book has nothing to do with cheese, really, right? So the book, his wife just had a baby, and it changed their lives. So he said, "Look, you need to read this book because your life as a married man is about to change." And the book was like you would say a parable, right? It's written in a parable form. It's about these mice, and and basically the whole idea of the book, and actually that book was a rage back in the late 90s, early 2000. That's how old I am, yes. The book was a rage. In fact, it sold 26 million copies, I saw this week. And it was translated into 37 languages. And basically, the book's idea is that the only thing you can count on life is the fact that change will be constant. Your life will change, right? You will change. You will become a different person. Um, it's hard to explain that to younger people when you say, hey, you're not going to hold on to these views that you have now and you feel so passionate about at 22 or at 18 or at 16. You're not going to be the same person at 42, 62, or 82, right? Everyone at 16 thinks they're going to save the world. When you get to like about 60, you're like, you know what? The world can save itself. I'm just going to enjoy this Coke with this plastic straw, right? Like you think that. You don't. Why? Because I think that you change. You evolve. Your mind evolves. You become a different person. Slowly, but you do, right? And that book really dealt with that. It dealt with changes, and it actually it ended up being a really, I don't know if you remember reading it, those of you who know the book. It's actually a fun read. It's short, but it's fun, and especially in the world of business, it's helpful to think and change. The change is the only constant. But praise be to God that He does not change, right? God is not like us. He's not like you. He's not like me. He is not subject to change. Why? Because God is immutable. God is immutable. If you really think about this, the word that as we're looking at God's attributes, R.C. Sproul says this is the attribute of God that is in the negative, right? God does not change. God is not able to mutate. There's no mutation in God. So we're going to look at this morning about that. We're going to see how God is immutable. And my prayer is, and it has been this week, that we will be able to worship Him in spirit and in truth. As we meditate, as we see God's immutability, how He doesn't change, that He is constant. And and God in His consistency, the fact that He's constant, becomes the firm God that we can trust in Him. So, look at letter B in your introductions. Classical theism. Yes, again, we talked about, remember 2 weeks ago? I don't expect you to remember 2 weeks ago. I do remember it. What did we talk about 2 weeks ago? Something very simple. What did we talk about? Simplicity. Yes, you guys are awesome. Thank you. I feel so much better. Yes, we talked about divine simplicity. And what did we say about divine simplicity? Yeah, so it's not like God is a pizza, right? Remember the story of the pizza? He's not a BLT, right? Notice everything has to do with food. But it's true, right? God is not a BLT. He's not 30% this, 30% that. God is, right? And these attributes have to do with His essence, right? And we said that. We said that classical theism, it's a view that basically sees that God does not derive anything from outside of Him. Nothing. Nothing. God is not caused to be by anything. He is the first cause for everything. And whatever happens around God does not cause Him to change or to be moved. Nothing outside of God changes God, right? He's not thinking, oh, now I have to screw. He wasn't thinking in Genesis 3, what do I do with sin? God knows. He is. He's not thinking, oh my goodness, you lost your job. I wasn't thinking about this. God is. God is. And immutability is an attribute that shows us that again. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at another attribute of God, impassibility. If we finish with this, which we might not, so it's fine, right? As a friend of mine said, it's fine, it's fine. So it is fine, right? It is fine. So we're gonna try to do as much work as we can on immutability. But this is that part of classical theism, right? That God is immutable, and He's so immutable, we can say, that nothing around Him is going to make Him change. Now, how do we define immutability, right? So how do we define immutability? When we talk about immutability or the immutability of God, we can affirm what theologians say. For example, Stephen Charnock said, the God is immutable in His essence, His nature, and perfections. Did you see those three things? His essence, His nature, the nature of God does not change, and His perfections. Remember, perfections is another word for attributes. And we're going to talk about this in a few minutes. But the idea that God's attributes are never going to change. He is not more holy today than He was 2,000 years ago. And He is not more omnipresent today than He was, or less omnipresent today than He was 2,000 years ago. God doesn't change even in His perfections. Tozer says, to say that God is immutable is to say that He never differs from Himself. He never differs from Himself. That's important, right? We're going to see this, that there have been many attacks on that idea that God differs from Himself. Herman Bavinck says, He is unchangeable so that He eternally remains the same. And all variableness and turning are owing to the creature and the relationship in which the creature places himself over against God. Now, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to digest what he just said. Remember, Herman Bavinck was a Dutch theologian, and the Dutch people think very deeply about these things. And this probably was written about 150 years ago, or 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. So what is he saying here? I want you to look at what he says. Because out of this, it's going to depend the next part that we are going to talk about. So he's unchangeable, said he eternally remains the same, right? We agree with that. And he says, all variableness, what's another word for variableness? Yeah, all change and turning are owing to whom? Us, the creature. And what? Yeah. So, in a sense, who's the one that changes? We change, right? We established that, right? If I was to talk to a 20-year-old Joe Coe, would he be the same 40-year-old Joe Coe that you are now? No, right? You change. You've changed, right? You're a different person now that you were 20 years ago, right, Joe? Uh, Same thing with all of us. We change. We're constantly changing. Even our understanding of God changes, right? Think about what when you first got saved, what did you know about God? Especially if God saved you when you were young. Well, you probably knew sin. You knew that God was the creator. He was holy. And that's about it, right? You knew that Jesus was a savior. But now, after years of being saved, your understanding of God is different. Did God change? Did he show you a different side of him? Even the idea of side, remember when we talk about simplicity? We talked about simplicity. Why? So God doesn't change. And that's the idea that Bavinck is bringing into what I think is probably one of the best definitions of it, right? We are the ones that change. God doesn't change. And we've said it pretty much every week that we've been studying. This is the 9th week, if you can believe it, this is the 9th week that we've been looking through the attributes of God. And every week I've said this, that God is God and we are not God, right? We are the ones that change. He doesn't change. God doesn't change because God is infinite. I'd like to, hopefully, in the future, to talk about how God is infinite and what that means. Even the idea of infinite in our mind, it's kind of like eternity, right? We don't have a grid to understand someone who is infinite, even someone who is unchangeable like God. Now, why did we go through Bavinck? Well, because about 100 years ago, really, sadly, about 100 years ago now, in about 1920s, there were some theologians, liberal theologians, that started kind of thinking through the idea of God and change. And they started thinking, their premise was this: is not the ability to change better than the ability not to change? I want you to think about that. As a human being, is the ability to change better than the ability not to change? Well, as a society, with modernist and postmodern ideas, we prize the idea that change is so important, right? We like things to change. We established that already, that you and I have changed, right? I'm not the same person I was when I was 15, and my ideas have changed. I have progressed in my understanding of things, and so have you. So as a society, we say things like, he's so progressive, or he's so broad-minded, or he's non-traditional, or non-conventional, or open-minded, or unorthodox, or avant-garde, if you're a little more, more sophisticated, right? And what they're saying is that this person is cutting edge. Depending of where you are, especially in the political spectrum, right? You might think that's a great idea, or you might think that's a really bad idea, right? But when we think about that, we think of people change, they evolve, their ideas evolve. They're not the same person they were even 5 years ago. That's even one of the things we say about people. Hey, that guy calls himself a believer, but there's no change in him, right? He still thinks like a child, or he's a baby Christian, we say. But when it comes to God, God doesn't change. And change with God, it's never good. It's never good when we think about this. Look at what open theism and process theology in the 1920s, this idea that God changes became a fringe movement, especially starting with what they call process theology and later what it became open theism. So I want you to look at open theism first, right here, and I'm going to have uh, Biblia. I have a lady read today. How about that? Biblia, can you read that open theism? This is Tim Challies, a famous blogger. I truly think that he does the best definition. At least, I guess I want the cookies down in the lower shelf when I think about open theism, and he really did put it on the low shelf. And I want you to see what he says. Please.
Open theism is a sub-Christian theological construct which claims that God's highest goal is to enter into a reciprocal relationship with man. In this scheme, the Bible is interpreted without any anthropomorphism. That is, all references to God's feelings, surprise, and lack of knowledge are literal, and the result of his choice to create a world where he can be affected by man's choices. God's exhaustive knowledge does not include future free will choices by mankind because they have free will.
Thank you. Do you see what the open theism is saying? Is open theism says that God has entered into a reciprocal relationship with men. That God, in a sense, our relationship with God depends on God and men. And in a sense, if you really think about this, it's what a lot of people around us believe. They might not call themselves open theists, right? But they believe that. I've heard people say things like that. Well, God is just waiting on you to make your decisions or to look for him. He's just waiting there, waiting. He's waiting. But that's not all bad in a sense. Then when you're taking and you're saying that the Bible is so literal that all the anthropomorphisms that you find in the Bible, like, for example, what's an anthropomorphism? Yeah, God has a hand, right? Or the outstretched arm of Yahweh as he saves the people out of Israel. Or God has eyes or ears, right? A nose. He wrinkles his nose when he's angry. That's what the Hebrew says. So God has all these things. Those are literal. That's not a way for us to understand Scripture. And also, when he's talking about feelings, hopefully we're going to talk about next week, surprise and lack of knowledge that are literal. When God asked they would go as far as saying this. When God asked Adam, "Where are you?" He really didn't know where Adam was. He really didn't know what had happened. Because he is changing and he's acquiring knowledge. Now, how does that relate to immutability? It's that before open theism, process theology became something very, very important, especially in the beginning in academic circles. In the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you didn't hear this at church. No one thought these things. It became first a big thing in the academic world. And basically, they would say things like, God is both absolute and relative. That's impossible. But anyway, God is absolute. God is, in one aspect of his strict being, he is God, but he also is able to change. He's absolute in the sense that he doesn't change, but he's also not so restrictive that he doesn't change his mind on things. So, really, what is constant, what doesn't change, is the fact that God is he's in a process, in a development. That is incredible to think about that. Because that became, in the 1930s and 40s, in academia, especially in the United States, it became this idea of that God, with time, learns new things and changes his mind on things. Or maybe not change his mind, but he's in the same process that you and I are in development. Look at what Wayne Grudem says about this. Lexi, you want to read for us?
God's unchangeableness has been denied frequently in recent years by advocates of processuality, a theological position that says that process and change are essential aspects of genuine existence, and that therefore God must be changing over time also, just like everything else that exists. They would affirm that God is continually adding to himself all the experiences that happen anywhere in the universe. Thus, God is continually changing.
This is incredible because, again, 60 years ago, you wouldn't hear this at any church. But now, think about where we are right now. Think about what people are thinking about life, gender roles, gender identity. I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about in Christian churches, and you saw that, Christian churches, how that is changing. And they're saying, what about God? Those Christian progressives. That those people are fine because what? The times have changed, right? The times have changed, right? So in a sense, God changes, and what makes, did you catch what makes God change? What is it?
The environment.
Not the environment so much. What was it? Yes, his relationship with men. Because he has a relationship with men, God changes. So they would go as far as saying, well, in eternity past, right? We understand that yesterday from our conversation on eternity last week. But in eternity past, God was not in a process of change. He was not developing in change. But now, because he is in a relationship with us, he changes. So he is reacting to what's going on in 2023 different than he would in the 1960s. So in the 1940s, he might have thought something different, but in 2023, now God has to be pro LGBTQ plus, or he has to be pro all these things because he now has gathered new knowledge to be able to judge that. It is amazing to think about that. But that is the premise that is being set constantly. I remember, I'm this old, I remember when open theism became the thing. We're talking early 2000s, and open theism was coming sort of out of the closet of academia, and it started coming into churches. And in the beginning, I remember 2004, when I started seminary, 2005, 2003, 2004, it was just sort of a fringe movement. We don't have to worry about these lunatics, But you know what? Now it's part of the church. Part of churches. People are reading books by open theists, right? They're listening to these ideas. There are preachers on TV who are preaching these things that God changes. And even in our own minds, not maybe us, but in our mind, you will encounter people that will say things like, well, with God, which God changes. They wouldn't say it just like that. But God is, he is, as we're going to see next week, he is as horrified by this as you are. He is, all these things. They attribute to God all these different things. And all of that is change. It's change. So, what if God changes with the times? What if he is affected by us? What would happen? I want you to think about this, right? If God really does change, if he changes with the times, if he is not as immutable as we thought he was, what if God was affected by me, by my choices, by what I think? What would happen to him? I want you to think about that. What would happen to God? What would happen to the world if God is affected by your ideas? Yeah, what would happen?
I think you'd have basically no standard for salvation. You lose your...
No standard for salvation. Yep.
What were we saying?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, those things should change, right? What else?
How do we know that God would still be good?
Yeah, well, even your idea of good, right? So what if God thinks this is good, or he thought this was good today, but not tomorrow, or that was back then, right? Absolutely, absolutely. It will alter your faith. I think that that's the key right there. You're limiting God. You're putting him in a box, right? You're putting God in a box and you're just saying, look, you belong here. And you're one of the many ideas that are out there. This is why this is not just a sub-Christian group. This is not just one of the many views in church history. This, and I have to be careful when I say that this will be heretical to believe this. Now, there are people that are saved and have believed this. I'm not saying all of them. But it would lead into a heretical way of salvation. If you truly, truly believe that you are affecting God for who he is, and you're affecting his essence, and that God is completely different because of who you are. And also, think about the hubris that me, a lowly human, would actually change the mind of God in different things. And of course, they would bring this, they would say, well, how about, and we all have those examples, right? How about when God changed his mind in the Bible, right? Do you know any examples of God changing his mind? The flood, yeah, Moses. Any other ones? Yeah, what else? Nineveh? Who said Nineveh? Good. Someone remembers care group. Good, yeah. So God relented. So you're thinking, oh, so God does change his mind, right? Because I see these things. And you saw that God changes his mind. And we would say what to that? What if someone, let's play a little, let's play a little apologetics here. What if someone says to you, God does change his mind. I affect his choices. Look at big... What's that? So his mind change is predetermined. What would be a better way to explain that?
Most of the cases, he's wanting to be grace on the people till the very end with Abraham's argument.
Okay, so you're saying he's doing this. Then why use that language? John, you said something with your lips. I'm not a very good lip reader. You either say this terrible or that. Go ahead. This is the worst class ever. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. He's using human language, right? For example, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? What do we mean by that? Right? Like R.C. Sproul says, do we think that he's a rancher? That he's going and having a shootout at the OK Corral with Satan, who's a rustler from the beginning? No, right? He's not, right? What do we mean by the fact that he owns the cattle of 1,000 hills? That he what? Owns everything. Yes, he owns everything. When we see that God with an outstretched arm saved Israel from the house of slavery, what do we read? Do we actually think that he actually put his arm out and got Israel out? No, what do we mean by that? Yeah, the strength, the power of God, right? The arm of God, right? Or the eyes of the Lord are everywhere. We're meaning that he is what? He is omniscient, that he is omnipresent, that he's everywhere, right? When he's angry in Hebrew, wrinkle in his nose, he doesn't have a real nose. We talked about this in spirituality, right? All those things are anthropomorphisms. And we understand this. And this language is the same thing. It's anthropomorphisms. So that you and I can understand this. Do you remember that quote from Calvin? I know it was a long, long time ago. When we talked about the attributes of God in the very, very beginning. And he said, God speaks to us as we speak to our kids. Do you remember that quote, sort of? And he said that sort of like the way we talk to our kids, we talk to them with baby talk. Oh, your tummy hurts. We're not explaining to them what's going on in their stomach like a gastroenterologist would talk to us, right? Why? Because they can't handle it, right? You're trying to speak to a 1-year-old and you're saying, Jovi, your stomach hurts because blah, 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 blah. You ate this and it does this and lactose is not very good for you. And this is why we stay away from these kinds of... You don't do that to her. You just said, oh, your tummy hurts. Ah, right? Why? They can't handle that. And the same thing we couldn't handle. We couldn't even understand anything. This is why there's all these anthropomorphisms. And also, it's the sovereignty of God over everything, right? That he, in his sovereignty, is having a conversation with Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah and how he's going to destroy them. And he's trying to elicit this response from Abraham. We can say that. Any questions on that? Yes.
You can just touch a little bit on like the incarnate Christ and how this relates to.
Thanks. We'll talk about this in a second. Yes, but the question is, I just knew you were going to ask that question. If it wasn't you, someone else. But yes, how do we, so God doesn't change, how do we understand the incarnate Christ changing, right? We will talk about this. If I haven't, by the end of his being, please bring that up. But yes. All right, so what does it mean that God, or what does it exactly mean that God is immutable? I want to talk about three things. Number one, I want to talk about that God doesn't change in his being. That God doesn't change in his being. A writer once said, this doctrine, and the quote is right there in front of you, affirms that God ontologically and decretally, basically his decrees, does not and cannot change. God, as a person, as an essence, cannot change, right? He is not, in a sense, he doesn't change, and his decree doesn't change. Now, we're going to talk, when we talk about actually what does it mean to you and I as we apply this, we're going to talk about the decree of God not changing. But if you think about this, his nature, the infinite nature of God is not subject to change like you and I, right? One of the fun things to do sometimes when you go visit someone is to show you their wedding pictures, especially if they haven't gotten married last year and they got married some years ago. And you see those pictures. I never forget this. One time I was visiting my grandparents before they passed. And I saw this young couple, really good looking couple. And in a big picture, and I was probably like 15, 16. And I said to my grandma, oh my goodness, this woman is so beautiful. And that guy, so who are they? Are they friends of yours? My grandma was not tickled by that. Trust me. She was very upset about it. Why? Because obviously she was in her 80s now, and there had been some changes, right, in her life. Right? She was 20, and now she was 80, and it was a different world for her. But it's true, right? You show me pictures, and usually, and if I show you pictures of me and Melissa, you probably say about me, like, what happened? Time happens, right? But God is not subject to change, right? God is not subject to change. His nature and his being is infinite, and even though it's infinite, it does not change in any part at all. I love that quote by Pink. Melissa, can I have you read that quote since you're back there smiling? The one by Pink.
His nature and his being are infinite and so subject to no limitation. There was never a time when he was not. There never will come a time when he shall cease to be. God has neither evolved, grown, nor improved. All that he is today, he has ever been, and ever will be.
Well, that is such a great quote. Think about, we're not in the part where we are applying this yet, but think about the solace that it brings to your heart to know that even though God is infinite, his nature and his being are not subject to change or mutation. That there will never be a time when there will not be God. I don't know if you think about this. Hopefully you're not like me, but I eventually think things like there is going to be a time where I'm not going to be on this earth, right? That my great-grandkids won't know my name. I'm going to be forgotten, right? Just like my great-grandparents and my great-great-great-grandparents have been forgotten, right? There's going to be a time where you will be forgotten, right? Unless you're some amazing person in history and you create and you invented something. I'm not. I haven't done anything. So I know you guys. That's my. But in a sense, it's like we're all going to be forgotten, and yet God will never be forgotten, and He will always be, right? That's amazing to think about this. I want you to turn with me to Psalm 102. Psalm 102. I love this psalm. I want to look at just a couple of verses, but the psalmist in this psalm, what he's doing is he is comparing and contrasting the fleeting life of a person, of a created being, with the eternity of God, right? And I want you to look what he says. Uh, he's talking about how God. He's saying he's talking about man being afflicted, and he's asking God for His mercy on himself, right? And he says this after talking about all these people, right? He says, verse 12, but you, O Lord, abide forever in your name to all generations. Did you see that? See, apart of talking about the eternity of God, right, which we talked about last week, he tells us, and he tells himself, that God doesn't change. He abides forever. I mean, if you look at the first 11 verses, right, it's incredible. He's asking God for help. He's saying, God, help me. You need to help me. Look at me. Look what's going on. I'm looking for you. I'm like withering away. Please help me. Please help me. And then he says, but you, oh Lord, I might wither away like grass, but you, oh Lord, you abide forever in your name to all generations. And then look at verse 26. Look at verse 26. The psalmist says, again, he's calling himself to worship. Imagine, he's going through, there's something, we don't know what exactly. The only thing we know is by the superscript in the beginning, before verse 1, that says, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint before the Lord. Do you see that in the beginning before verse 1? And look what he says in verse 26. So imagine, he's afflicted. He's trying to see what's going on, and then he says, verse 26, even they will perish, but you remain, and all of them will wear out like a garment. You will change them as clothing. They will be changed. Verse 27, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. Your sons, verse 28, your sons and the sons of your servants will remain, and his descendants will be established before you. You see, like, just when you think that life is completely out of control, when you are afflicted, what the psalmist here is doing is he's clinging to not only the eternity of God, he's clinging to the unchangeable nature of God. See, he said, these people, these bad people that are causing me all these problems, they're going to perish. But you're going to still be here. They're going to wear out like a garment, right? Just imagine how that garment takes, that toll. You don't wear the same pair of pants that you wore, for 20 years straight, right? Those are some pair of pants. Why? They wear out. But then he says, they will be changed, but you are the same. Verse 27. Your years will have no end. It doesn't matter how old you are. And the sons of your servants will remain, and his descendants will be established before you. Which is incredible to think about that, right? God doesn't change. God doesn't change. There's not a time where God is going to be completely different or even change in 1 millimeter, if you're thinking of a measurement. Now, look at that quote that I have for you after. Trish, do you want to read that for us, please? The one that starts with knowing that God.
Knowing that God is the only one to help him, he asks God to do so. The psalmist's awareness that his life is short and fragile leads him to reflect on God's eternal nature. God was there at the beginning when he created the heavens and the earth. They will not last forever, but God will survive them. They are perishable, but God is imperishable. Since he will be there forever, he will be there in future generations, for the present generation's children and their children's children, and so on.
Well, thank you. That's an amazing quote on this psalm, right? God is the only one that can help the psalmist, and this is why he clings to that unchanging nature of God. This is not the part of the application. We're going to deal with this in a few minutes, but think about this, how that brings, it brings your heart to worship God, to know that God remains the same. He doesn't change. Thomas Manton, a Puritan, said, this is an attribute that, like a silken string through a chain of pearls, runneth through all the rest. You know what he means by this? He means that all of God's perfections are unchanging. All of God's perfections are unchanging. Every single one of them. God doesn't change in his omniscience. God doesn't change in his omnipotence. God doesn't change in his love. That's incredible, right? God doesn't change in his holiness. He doesn't change at all. In a world that is constantly changing, right? We talked about this before, right? Where things are different. Well, we're not sure what's right, what's not right. God remains the same. Now, you might say to me, if you are Nathan or Nathaniel or Branson, Nate, for the friends, well, how about Christ, right? Christ, the second person of the Trinity, has changed, right? He has mutated, right? What would you say to that? No, Dave already said no. Absolutely not. Yes, okay, so very good, very good. So, what is the incarnation, right? Pretend this is Christmas and we a little colder outside and we're having hot chocolate after this. We all usually have these conversations around Christmas. So pretend this is Christmas. How is the incarnation, how is that not a mutation on the being of God?
Takes on flesh.
Yes. That's very important. He takes on flesh, right? He takes on flesh. Nothing changes in the deity. Nothing changes in the deity. We sing a song I love. My favorite hymn ever is "And Can It Be?" Right? But it has a couple of problems, that song. And it's still my favorite, right? I'll tell you the other problems some other day. One of the problems that it has, it says, emptied himself, but all but love. And the other problem is, and bled for Adam's helpless race. And then the other problem is, amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst, what? Die for me. Did God die? Can God die? So the body, the human body of Jesus died. But God couldn't die, right? Right? Emptied himself of all but love means this, that Jesus stopped, he emptied himself, which is, when we talk about our heresies, when I said, remember I wanted to do that series eventually called Know Your Heretics? We will do that. We're going to talk about the kenotic heresy. That is a heresy that a lot of people sadly believe and sing often, which is this idea that God completely emptied himself and the only thing that stood there was, as a God, just love. That is not true. That would say that God, there was mutation in God. And there's no mutation in him. So God, the very God, takes on humanity. He takes on humanity. What dies is not God. Because what would happen if God died? What? I heard a bunch of different, what? So he would have committed sin. He would cease to be eternal.
There'd be nothing left of anything.
Yes, Jackie, yes. Everything would just, why? Because he upholds everything, right? You and I would, the whole world, the universe, the word just escaped me, right? We would have completely died. So do I think it's a great song? Yes, the lyrics of that song are amazing. I still love that song. I quoted that when I got baptized. But really, if we really mean what we're singing, I don't know what. Esther, it's okay. She was shocked. She was like, oh my gosh, I've been singing that song forever. She threw a plate down. It's fine. Don't worry about it. But it's true. Yeah, we just need to change the words of that, right? But it's true to think about that, right? If you really think about what we're singing, you wouldn't say emptied himself of all about love. You can, and also God can't die because the second person of the Trinity takes on flesh, and that flesh is what dies. But Jesus can't die. Yeah, that was the question that one of my sons had, and when I talked to John about it, notice he didn't talk to me, and about did the Trinity break apart during the cross? Can the Trinity ever be broken apart? No, it can't, right? But can a human die? Yes. Jesus died. Did he suffer? Yes. Did he feel what we felt? Of course he did, right? Was he thirsty, or he was just saying he was thirsty? Was he sad when Lazarus died, or he was just saying he was sad? No, of course. In humanity, he experienced everything that you and I have experienced, right? Because he took on humanity. But he is God. He never ceased being God. He couldn't change that. Right? You can't change. There's no mutation with God. When you're saying that there's mutation with God, or you're trying to use this like gymnastics to get through that idea that God died, then you're committing a huge heresy, which you're saying that God can die, and God doesn't die, right? So when you're singing, and I know that maybe we haven't thought this through, but when we're saying amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? We probably should be like, that thou, my Jesus, or thou, my Christ, or thou, my Lord, shouldst die for me? Yes. Yeah, I would take that anytime. Emptied himself? No. We could probably, maybe someone that knows rhyme, we can say like, he took on flesh. Yes, probably, yeah. That would be better. Any questions with this? Thank you. I wasn't trying to lead with this, Kyle.
So I think it's in Philippians 2 it talks about the incarnation, right? It says like he took on humility.
Yeah.
How like in the Bible when it talks about God explains specific like emotions in like greater comparison to others, how does that work if he's not changing? It's like, oh, God will be mad, or God will be take on humility. But he's not changing his character. So
his character will never change, right? So so that would be an anthropomorphism for us to understand what is going on there. Mm-hmm. But God does not change. And we're going to talk about this next week, or maybe in 2 weeks, it seems like. But we're going to talk about probably in 2 weeks the idea of impassibility. That God is not driven by emotions like you and I do, right? We actually, and that's a big issue in the church. You probably heard it the other way around, that God is driven by emotions. This is why he came to earth, because he just saw us and he's like, oh man, I didn't expect them to. But really, God is not driven like emotions. He's not angered the way that we are angered. He's not, and I think that we who can create this God that it's just like us. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we talked about this when we talked about simplicity, right? We think that that we are the image of God, which is true, so thus God has to be like me. And that's not true. Just because you are the image of God, God is not you. You're just the image of God. And broken, obviously, right? We talked about this when we looked at anthropology. Taylor, this better not be one of those questions that you ask.
No, so when he talks about like Jesus growing in wisdom,
Yes.
how do you explain that then? Right?
The same way you would. How would you explain that? Well, again, was he learning things? Did he have to learn did he come out of the womb saying, I am the God man? What do you guys need? No, he didn't say that, right? He was learning just like a baby, right? He took on humanity. Amazingly enough, it's one of those impossible things for us to understand that Jesus was learning, and he had to learn how to talk. He had to go to school. He had to learn how to read and write. All those things didn't just come, prepackaged in his factory setting, right? He had to do the same thing. He was in diapers. All these different things. If you think about it, he was hungry the same way. But imperfection. Just imagine having Jesus as your brother, right? The older brother, the perfect brother. And constantly perfect in every single way. And having to learn new things. Like, seriously, he had to learn who he was. Have you thought about that? That we went to synagogue today. They were talking about me. Right? I mean, I think that's what it is. We have this idea. We have either two ideas, that Jesus was more God than human, thus he was sort of like Superman, right? Have you ever heard of this? This is like the worst example ever. They say like Jesus was like Clark Kent. Am I that nerdy? You don't know who Clark Kent is? You do know, right? Where are my nerds? It's like, yeah, good. It's like Clark Kent, who underneath his clothes, he has the Superman costume, right? And so he's constantly Superman. He just chooses not to dress like Superman. Well, that's not how God is. He took on flesh, meaning he was 100% human and 100% God. Now, how does that work? I love to tell you how. Not only do we not have time, I don't know really how it works, but we'll go with time so you don't think I'm stupid. But it's like, but it is hard. Yes, Kyle.
So Christ in his humanity was subject to change, but when he...
Yeah, I don't like the in his humanity because it sounds like now we're having this dichotomy. Like, yeah, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, does that then like his ability to grow and learn stop during like when he dies and is resurrected?
Yeah, so it's just like a human, but he has a body now, right? He forever has a body, so he is now localized somewhere. Eventually, I'd love to do Christology, but he is localized. His body is localized somewhere. In his spirit, he is omnipresent. But Jesus is somewhere. Where is he? Yeah, he is at the right hand of the Father, right? He's at the right hand of the Father. But so he is localized. So he's forever going to have that body, just like us. And we just read, went through in our care group a couple weeks ago, Zechariah, right? And they're going to look on him who they pierced. Remember that? They're not looking at some ghost, right? You know that they're looking. They're looking at someone they recognize. I don't know if does that answer your question? Not really.
I just like he's growing old.
That's a kind way to say, kind of not. Not really. We do what we can, Kyle. Yeah, so he, at the moment of his death, yeah, it's just like any person that dies. At the moment of his death, he dies. He wasn't asleep for 3 days. He really did die. So, but he still retains that human body, now glorified. But he retains that human body that he can be recognized because his disciples recognized him. Remember? So, yeah. Um, so God doesn't change in his being. Remember, and we'll end with this. Sorry. We'll continue this. I told John there's no way we're going to get through. I'm in page 6 of 15. So next week we'll look at this. But a couple more things just to tie this off. God doesn't change in his being. Do you remember when uh, uh, it was really interesting to see that God always, when he introduces himself in the Old Testament, he is, right? When he's talking to Abraham, when he's talking to Moses and so forth and so on, he is. And notice how constantly, we're going to talk about this next week, now that we know it's next week. Did you notice how the prophets, especially the minor prophets, as we've gone through them in Care Group, they're clinging to this idea that God doesn't change. Basically with his promises. And we're going to talk about this next week. But they cling to this idea. Now, very quickly here. And we're going to go through this next week. But I wanted to just say, okay, so what does it mean to you and me? As you look at here and look at page, I think it's page 4. What are the implications of this doctrine? We're going to go through this next week. I just want to look at that idea of worship. You see Roman number 4a, worship. There's a song by Sovereign Grace that says, "You have been our dwelling place, a rock amid the waves. Though everything around us shakes, your truth will still remain our anchor forever. Lord, you never change. You will never change. From everlasting, you are God. Your love forever will endure forever. Your promises are sure to everlasting. You are God." And it's a song, I think we probably sang it here, or maybe we haven't sang it in a long time. But it's really interesting that this doctrine propels us to worship God. Because if he did change, if he is that, quicksandy God, that, well, one day he thinks this, tomorrow he thinks something else, then we're doomed. We're doomed. Nothing, you've said it before, right? What would change? Someone said our salvation, the terms of salvation, we'll talk about this next week, his patience with us, right? All of these things, which if he would change, if he would just say, you know what? This salvation by faith alone has gone long enough. I'm going to institute works now. Imagine if he did that. But he doesn't change. What if he would have said to Israel, you know what? It's been a couple thousand years since Abraham all the way to, you know what? You rejected my Messiah. Well, I'm done with you. I'm going to blow this whole thing up. But he didn't, right? He didn't do that. And he didn't do it because we're awesome or because Israel is awesome. But he did it because, really, he is awesome. And we can trust in him. So next week, we're going to look a little bit more. We're going to see more of our unchanging God. If you have questions, bring them next week. I really, really want to talk about this. If you have questions now, please come up to me, talk to me. I'd love to answer any questions you might have. So, Charles, you want to pray for us?
Father,